Hi, my name is Liz and this is the Pink Lookbook. There are thousands of videos out there about luxury handbags, especially about brands such as Chanel or Hermes. And what most of these brands have in common is that they are based in the typical fashion hubs such as Paris or Milan. But today we are going to travel to a city which is not necessarily associated with fashion. We are traveling to Brussels and we are going to look into the company history of Delvaux. Delvaux is almost 200 years old and today they are mostly known for their luxury handbags, but similar to their French competitors such as Louis Vuitton or Goya, they also started out as trunk makers, and we are going to see many similarities in the company history. Furthermore, I find it very interesting how female leaders drove the success of the company, and Delvaux is also a company which is closely associated not only to the Belgian royal family, but also to the history of the country itself. And some people actually call the company the Belgian version of Hermes. So we can discuss this in the comments later on, but let's now start at the beginnings. And just a brief side note, this is a non-sponsored video and I'm just sharing my personal opinion and my research here. The business Delvaux was started by Charles Delvaux and his wife Jean-Joseph Présent, and it actually operated under the name Delvaux Présent. They were selling trunks and travel items, and this is a very close link to their own family history because family members had been working as saddle makers, chest makers, dressmakers, merchants, wheelwrights. So this is reflected also in the business that Delvaux and Présent founded together. As I mentioned before, Delvaux is closely linked to Belgium's history. Some people even say that Belgium has grown up with Delvaux because when Belgium was founded, Delvaux was already 1 year in operation, and it was the time after the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Waterloo had just taken place 14 years prior at the doorstep of Brussels. But now there was a period of relative peace in Europe. Travel could be resumed for business and increasingly also for leisure. So this was a very important setting also for Delvaux, and this is also reflected in their product range. And another important factor was that the area of the southern Netherlands, which became Belgium, was a major hub for the textile industry, and overall they benefited from the industrialization which was going on in Europe at the time. Furthermore, Antwerp was a really important port, not only for continental Europe, but also for travels to North America. Needless to say, this was very beneficial, but another major driver for their business was the development of the travel industry. In the same year as the founding of Delvaux in 1829, the steam locomotive was invented, and in 1835 there was the first railway link using such a steam locomotive from Brussels to Mechelen. And by the 1940s there was a very efficient network of railway links within Belgium itself, and Delvaux identified this opportunity and capitalized on it because they addressed the needs of this new type of travel. For example, they came up with leather cases for documents, also leather cases for salesmen who traveled a lot, and they also developed a special type of bag where you could separate your business items from your personal items in case you had to travel for several days. Roughly at the same time, Louis Vuitton in France came up with their signature stackable trunks. I talked about this in another video. And also Delvaux sold trunks, but they looked different. They were rounded at the top, and the reason is quite interesting because it reflects the weather in Belgium. Back then and even today there's a lot of rain in Belgium, and it was a priority that the water could run off, that it doesn't pool on top of the trunks, and this was obviously more important than being able to stack the suitcases. So this overall development of the travel industry was very important for Delvaux because more people were able to travel, they wanted to bring more things with them, so you needed more trunks, and also the overall industrialization made it easier to produce goods. Furthermore, sea travel became very popular, for example, from continental Europe to America via the Red Star Lines or other operators. And if you traveled first class, like Delvaux's customer base, it was very luxurious, and there were also a lot of social commitments on board. So you needed a big wardrobe with you. You needed a lot of trunks with you, and this was very beneficial for somebody like Delvaux. Travel was one thing that affected the Delvaux business, but there was another thing, and this was something that changed in European society overall. People started to go shopping as a leisure activity. Department stores came up. For example, in the 1840s in Brussels, the Galerie Royale Saint-Hubert were constructed. They were a very fancy shopping arcade where the flaneur, the chic flaneur, could shop to pass their free time. And this happened in many other European cities as well. For example, we have Harrods in London that was founded roughly at the same time. And one thing I would like to point out here, because it's also interesting in terms of business development, back then the branding was not around heritage or chic. They emphasized on the quality of the craftsmanship, the materials, and also the competitive pricing. We have arrived at the first half of the 20th century, and needless to say, the overall historic development and also economic development and the world wars affected the Delvaux business. They kept operating during the wars, but they had to make ends meet. For example, leather was very limited. It used to be imported from Germany, which obviously stopped, and the little leather that was still available was limited to essential items such as shoes. And this is reflected overall in the fashion industry, because when we look at fashion designs or, for example, bag designs from the 1920s or 30s, they very often use fabrics such as silk or even beadwork, because they couldn't use leather. And what is also interesting in terms of business is that Delvaux itself was rather a sales business, because they didn't produce many items in-house. And this only changed when Edmond Delvaux, who was the great-grandson of the founder, sold the business in 1933. He sold it to Franz Schwennicke, who had just returned from a colonial mission in Congo. And when I say he sold the business, it sounds really big, but what was actually left at the time in 1933 of the Delvaux business was a very old name and one storefront, because the business had been reduced to only one physical store. It is a bit random that somebody like Schwennicke acquired the business, because he had no experience in the luxury sector whatsoever. And he even admitted that in writing himself, and he said it took him until 1938, so 5 years, to really understand the business and the luxury market. But it took him even longer to achieve the first real breakthrough with the business. This was after the war in 1946 with the Avia suitcase. And this suitcase was heavily influenced by the increasing popularity in commercial air travel. And in a way, Schwennicke was a businessman, but also an inventor, because he came up with a very lightweight frame for the suitcase, and it could also be assembled and disassembled easily. So this was an advantage for travelers, but also for him business-wise, because he could export that product more easily. This suitcase was exported globally, and if Delvaux couldn't send the products directly to certain countries, they entered into license agreements to produce the suitcases over there. And by 1948, only 2 years later, they had sold 3,000 suitcases in Belgium alone. And why was this product so successful? Because they had a certain feeling for new travel trends. Before, travel was only accessible to aristocrats or very rich people who usually had other people carry their suitcases. But the new traveler, the adventurer of the 1940s, was a new person, and they carried their suitcases themselves. And this is why the lightweight Avia suitcase was so popular. Schwennicke changed basically the whole business. As I mentioned before, in the first half of the 20th century, most products were not produced in-house, and this was one of the things that he changed. He moved the production in-house again. And he also changed the branding, because as I said, Delvaux used to focus on the craftsmanship aspect, on the materials, on the competitive pricing. And he added an emotional perspective. He added the heritage and chic, and this is something that most of these brands do today. And Schwennicke now could do that because it was a very different situation from the time when Delvaux was founded. Because in the 19th century, Charles Delvaux was faced with the challenge that most people in Belgium thought luxury products can only come from cities like Paris or London. They did not really believe that a luxury product can be made in Brussels. So he had to lay the groundwork. And to establish this credibility, it took Charles Delvaux quite a bit of time. But one thing that really helped him was that he was granted to become an official purveyor of the Belgian court in 1883. He also became a supplier of the military, but this royal warrant allowed him access to the upper class, to the aristocrats, and it was kind of a seal of approval. So after that, more and more people believed that a luxury product can also be made in Brussels. And Schwennicke now built on almost 100 years of the business, but he had another challenge. He had to reapply for that royal warrant. And already when Charles Delvaux applied for it, it was quite tedious. We can assume that it took him around 10 years. This was the time that companies had to supply the royal court until they were granted the warrant. But for Schwennicke, it was even longer. It actually took him 25 years to regain that seal of approval. But this was the 1950s, and the royal warrant, while being a nice thing and a seal of approval, was not a major driver for a purchasing decision because times had changed. There was the arrival of pop culture, the American lifestyle was a big influence in Europe as well, and people were looking for something else. Schwennicke knew that. He knew that he had to create a very strong brand. What is the first step in branding? A logo. So he played on the heritage aspect. He created the signature carrosse logo, the silhouette of the horse-drawn carriage. But this was not the only thing that he had to do. He had to be very creative with editorials or also photographs that they shot at the atelier. And they also invested in really interesting marketing campaigns to address this American lifestyle. For example, Delvaux had their own basketball team. In general, the 1950s were a very important period for Delvaux in terms of creativity. They also added men's travel bags with compartments for cameras, tobacco, and pipes. And they also came up with their signature fastening, which has become a Delvaux house code, but it was also developed out of a necessity. Their new type of customer traveled to work on the Brussels tram. There was a lot of pickpocketing going on, so they wanted to make the handbags safer. And also the handbag designs changed. Delvaux had to adapt the designs to also reflect what was going on in society overall, because we can see that handbags also kind of reflect female empowerment. During the war, women actually carried more bags with shoulder straps because it allowed them more freedom of movement. And this is also something that Coco Chanel took up in her 255 bag. You may remember I mentioned that in my other video. It also shows that women became more independent. They didn't want to carry a bag that was impractical and then depend on their husband to carry certain items. It also shows that increasingly women traveled by themselves. And this is also something that Delvaux had to take up in their designs, and they reflected it in various models, for example, the Cobalt model. And as I said, branding was a key task for Schwennicke. The heritage was one thing. Delvaux had to prove that they are chic. So how do you prove that? You send your design team to France to the haute couture shows, and then you actively advertise that you did that to show that you occupy yourself with the current fashion trends, that you incorporate this in your collections. And they also started to produce 2 new collections per year, which they still do. And also all the handbags, the many handbags that Delvaux has created, are registered in their so-called Golden Book. And another thing that he actively used was the collaboration with the so-called Trentaine. These were 30 companies based in Belgium, among them Elizabeth Arden, the cosmetics business, and they pooled their resources for advertising campaigns, for example, to brush up their image, because they all had the same problem. They were luxury companies, but luxury had this image of being old and dusty, so they came up with creative ways of brushing up their image. For example, they also financed cultural events in Brussels. One thing that I personally find really interesting about Delvaux is the involvement of women as a driver for the success, because until 1945, they mainly served a male market, but this changed after the war. And it was very smart, and it was something that a lot of companies didn't do. Delvaux had a lot of female designers in the lead, for example, Madame Trier or Madame Allais, to just name 2 of them. And this was a key factor, that they could understand the female market that became more and more important for the company. And after Franz Schwennicke passed away in 1970, the company was passed over to the son of his first marriage and also his widow Solange. And I personally find that really interesting when we think about the times. This was the 1970s, and she at the time had 3 children under the age of 10. She had no formal training or experience whatsoever in the business, and she probably had to fight really hard to establish herself within the industry, but also within her own company, because she had to turn herself from being the boss's wife to being the leader of the company, to make the decisions. But never underestimate a woman, because simply by looking at the numbers, we can see how successful she was. By 1979, the revenue had increased to 100 million Belgian francs. Compared to 1970, where the revenues were 42 million, we can see that she more than doubled the sales of the company. Solange Schwennicke was also the person who heavily promoted their signature D logo, and since then Delvaux has always tried to bridge the gap between discreet luxury but also this need for this identification with a logo. And also what is interesting is that Delvaux then used her success and also the recognition that she got as their own asset. In 1979, the Benelux version of Marie Claire magazine featured Solange Schwennicke as a very successful businesswoman. She was a role model for many, so this was also a key component of the Delvaux brand. The 1980s were a very intense period of international expansion for Delvaux. It peaked in the opening of a high-profile store in Paris in 1994. This was also the time when her son Franz Schwennicke took over the business, and they also launched the so-called Deux collection to address younger customers. So again, it's always this challenge of bridging the gap between the heritage and also staying relevant. Schwennicke then also invited Christian Salé, who had previously been on the board, to take over a more active management position as CEO, and they jointly led the business. I tried to find more information about the current state of the business, but I have to admit it is a bit tricky to get a picture of the state of the business at the moment. In 2011, the company was acquired by the Hong Kong-based Fang Group. They acquired a majority stake. But in 2021, the Swiss Richemont Group took over. This is a Swiss conglomerate. You may know they also own Cartier. And there were also quite a few changes in the creative directors. So it is a bit of a question mark what is actually going on. I personally wondered what will change for Delvaux in the coming future, because when I look at Richemont, they are probably operating like the competitors LVMH, for example. So there will be probably more advertising, there will be a change of strategy. I just wonder if they will apply similar strategies to, let's say, Louis Vuitton or Dior, for example, more influencer marketing. So this remains to be seen. I'm also curious what you think about this. Do you think the strategy of Richemont will impact the brand in a positive or maybe in a negative way? But let's also quickly discuss the bags themselves. In the catalog for the 180-year anniversary in 2009, Delvaux says that not much has changed in the production process. Some steps have changed. For example, the laser cutting of the leather has become automated, but most of the finishing techniques are still the same. They are still very labor and time intensive. So this is also how they justify the craftsmanship and also their price points. What I personally found interesting is their archive of leathers, which dates back to the 1970s. And this is actually not an archive in the narrow sense, like in a museum. It is an active archive because Delvaux actively advertises that they can repair or renovate old bags. So until the 1970s back, they kept the leather to use for renovations. And they also say on the website, please don't try to renovate or repair your bag yourself. Please send it to us or talk to us, and then we can find a way to repair the bag for you. And while I was doing the research for this video, then I remembered I actually have an old vintage Delvaux bag from the 1980s. And when I read on the website, don't repair it yourself, I was like, okay, maybe this time I don't do a self-renovation project. Maybe I really get in touch with them. So I quickly wrote an email to Delvaux inquiring about the repair services. And now I'm waiting to hear back from them. And if they do get back to me and if we can fix it, of course, I can make a video for you if you wish. So let me know in the comments below. This is also a strategy that they actively advertise on their website, because it is said that the same amount of bags that Delvaux sells per year, the same amount is also sent into repairs or renovation. In the exhibition catalog, they say 8,000 bags come to Brussels to be renovated or repaired per year. And another characteristic of Delvaux is that they stick to certain types of leather from a special tannery in France. There were some outliers like metallic kangaroo skin, which was obviously popular in certain countries. but their core is certain types of leather, which they dye in a special way. They don't heavily pigment it because what they want to achieve over time is a patina instead of the handbag breaking over time. This is the information that they give on the website or in this exhibition catalog, but I would be curious if any of you actually own Delvaux bags and if you want to share your experience with them. And of course, I'm also interested if you think that Delvaux really is the Belgian Hermes. So let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and maybe subscribe to my channel. If you want more fashion related articles, you can also head over to my website, thepinklookbook.com. And if you like, you can also check out my fashion label Pelagona. And if you liked this video, I'm sure you would enjoy watching my other video where I explain how some celebrities became godmothers of iconic luxury bags. Thank you very much for watching this video and see you in the next one.